My name is Daniel Hayes. I am 34 years old, and I built my own software company from the ground up after spending my 20s living out of a one-bedroom apartment and coding until dawn. I never chased glamour or status. What I cared about was freedom, the ability to own my choices, and the quiet pride of knowing no one had handed me anything. When I met Claire, the woman who would later become my fiancée, I thought I had finally found someone who understood me beyond the surface. She came from wealth, a family whose name carried weight in country clubs and boardrooms. I didn't care about any of that. I cared about her laugh, the way she challenged me, the way she said she believed in me. But 3 days before the wedding, I learned what her family truly believed. It happened in their massive kitchen, the marble counters gleaming under lights that felt almost surgical in their brightness. Her parents sat across from me, their posture stiff, their expressions rehearsed. They slid a thick folder toward me, the kind of legal document meant to strip someone of dignity while pretending it was about protection. Claire didn't look me in the eye as her father cleared his throat and said it was just a standard prenuptial agreement, something to make things clean. But when I read it, I saw the truth. Every line was written as if I were some opportunist clawing for a slice of their fortune. In their eyes, I wasn't Daniel Hayes, a man who had built his own wealth and reputation. I was a risk, a threat, someone they had to put in his place. They smirked as though it was already settled, as if my silence meant defeat. Her mother even said softly, "It's best for everyone, Daniel. Sign it, and we can move forward." It wasn't the paper that burned me, it was the arrogance, the assumption that I needed them more than they needed me, the belief that I was some desperate man reaching upward toward their gilded ladder. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue. I closed the folder, slid it back across the table, and excused myself without a scene. In their eyes, that silence confirmed their victory. They believed they had broken me, or at least cornered me, into obedience. They didn't realize that silence has weight, and mine carried more than they could ever imagine. I drove home that evening in a storm of quiet thoughts. Anger wasn't there. Anger would have been too easy, too loud. What I felt instead was calculation, a sharpening clarity that cut through every illusion I had once held about their family. They had no idea who I truly was. They thought I was just a man lucky enough to marry into their wealth, someone who should bow in gratitude for their approval. They didn't know that I was worth $9 million already, with investments, patents, and partnerships carefully built away from the public eye. I had been discreet for a reason, and now that discretion was about to become my greatest weapon. That night I sat in my study, the lights dim, the city beyond my window flickering with indifferent life. I thought about the years I had spent learning to be patient in business, how silence had always been my advantage. Competitors underestimated me when I didn't argue or show my hand. By the time they realized what I was building, it was too late. This was no different. They had already shown their hand, the arrogance, the presumption, the dismissal of my worth. All I had to do was play mine with the same quiet precision I always had. 3 days before the wedding, I was supposed to feel love, nerves, excitement. Instead, I felt something colder, cleaner, sharper. It wasn't revenge in the childish sense. It wasn't about shouting or breaking anything. It was about balance, about letting them discover the truth, not by my words, but by the weight of their own miscalculation. They thought the prenup was the end of the conversation. In reality, it was only the beginning. The morning after they shoved that prenup in my face, I woke earlier than usual. The sun was barely cutting through the blinds, but my mind had already been awake for hours. Lying there, I replayed every moment of my relationship with Claire, scanning for the signs I had ignored. Loyalty had always been the currency I valued most, the silent glue in every friendship, every partnership, every love I had ever given. And yet, in her world, loyalty seemed to be conditional, a performance rather than a principle. I realized then that what I had mistaken for sophistication in her family was really a form of control dressed in expensive clothes. They had been measuring me since the first handshake, and I had been too blinded by love to notice. I thought back to small moments that now felt louder. The way her father once joked at dinner, asking if I was comfortable leaving the startup life behind when real money entered the picture. The way her mother smiled when I offered to pay for a trip, saying, "Oh, that's sweet, but you should save your pennies." Even Claire herself, who once insisted we use her family's lawyer for a minor contract, brushing off my hesitation with, "It's just easier that way." None of it seemed significant at the time. But now, in hindsight, I realized those were not harmless remarks. They were probes, little tests to see whether I would submit to their hierarchy. The emotional weight hit harder than I expected. I wasn't humiliated by the prenup itself. Money had never been the axis of my identity. What stung was the betrayal of trust, the quiet erasure of who I truly was. I had walked into that kitchen as a man who believed he was marrying a partner, someone who saw him as an equal. Instead, I walked out realizing that to her family, I was a project to be managed, a variable to be controlled, a risk to be minimized. Love, to them, was secondary to strategy. And if Claire went along with this, even silently, it meant her loyalty was already divided. But I didn't hate her. That was the strangest part. I sat with the disappointment, the hollow ache of realizing the person you love may never have seen you clearly. It wasn't anger, it was mourning. Mourning the simplicity of what I thought we had, mourning the illusion of unconditional trust. I had offered her everything I had, my time, my belief, my vulnerability. In return, I received a silent nod of compliance when her parents drew a line in the sand. I wasn't broken, but I was altered. In business, I had learned that betrayal often comes quietly, wrapped in a handshake, sealed with a smile, and the most dangerous mistake one can make is reacting too quickly, too emotionally. That morning, as I sat with coffee growing cold in my hands, I made a decision. I would not lash out. I would not confront, and I would not beg. I would listen. I would watch, and I would let their arrogance unfold naturally. They had already underestimated me, and underestimation is a more powerful ally than anger could ever be. The irony was not lost on me. For years, I had been the quiet man in the room, the one who listened more than he spoke, the one they assumed lacked sharpness, simply because he didn't brandish it. That had always been my edge. Now, with the stakes personal rather than professional, I realized the same principle applied. I would not need to raise my voice or fight for dignity. My dignity was already intact. It was theirs that would unravel, thread by thread, when they finally saw who they were really dealing with. That same week, while everyone else buzzed about final fittings and seating charts, I spent my evenings in silence, sifting through information. I wasn't searching for vengeance in the way most people imagine it. No dramatic explosions, no shouting matches. What I was after was clarity, leverage, and truth. I started with the prenup itself, reading through every line, every clause. It was aggressive, even insulting. But it was also sloppy. They had rushed it, relying on intimidation rather than precision. The irony struck me. A family so proud of their wealth had left themselves exposed in their arrogance. They were so focused on protecting themselves from me that they never considered what protections I might already have in place. I called my own attorney, not the kind who sipped cocktails with socialites, but a man I'd trusted for years. He didn't wear tailored suits, but he was razor sharp, the kind of lawyer who spotted loopholes others skimmed past. When I handed him the prenup, he smirked in a way that told me I wasn't crazy. There were weaknesses. He reminded me, too, that all of my assets were meticulously protected. Separate trusts, offshore investments, intellectual property patents secured under holding companies. In short, their precious document didn't hold the power they thought it did. They believed they were fencing me out, but in reality they were walking straight into a trap of their own making. Meanwhile, I started observing Claire more closely. She was nervous, distracted, constantly glancing at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. For the first time I noticed the small cracks in her confidence, the hesitation in her eyes. It dawned on me that perhaps she wasn't as comfortable with this plan as her parents were, but she also wasn't strong enough to push back. That weakness cut deeper than the prenup itself. If she couldn't defend me in the smallest room with her own family, how could she ever stand beside me in the larger battles of life? Still, I didn't confront her. I simply watched, letting her reveal herself through silence. One evening, I received an email from my financial advisor, an innocuous monthly update. But this time, I looked at it with different eyes. The numbers weren't just numbers anymore. They were shields, weapons, and tools of leverage. My portfolio had grown quietly, steadily, into a fortress. $9 million in assets, spread carefully, invisible to anyone not looking for it. To her family, I was still the man who drove a modest car and didn't flaunt designer suits. They didn't know that modesty was intentional, that invisibility was my greatest strength. Their wealth was loud, performative, bound by appearances. Mine was quiet, untouchable, and entirely mine. As the wedding day crept closer, the pressure from her parents intensified. Subtle comments during dinners, small reminders of how lucky I was, little digs disguised as jokes. I said nothing. I smiled politely. I let them think I was bending, but in my mind I was already envisioning the moment the mask would slip, the moment when they would realize that the power they thought they had over me was nothing more than a shadow. Silence, I reminded myself, is not weakness. It is the pause before the blade falls. By the second night, I had made my decision. I would not cancel the wedding in a burst of drama. I would not storm into their home with accusations. Instead, I would allow the ceremony to unfold exactly as they had envisioned, right up until the moment where truth would rewrite the script. My revenge would not be in words, but in the quiet unveiling of who I truly was, and who they truly were not. They had treated me like a beggar at the gates of their fortune. Soon, they would realize that the gates they were so proud of led nowhere I needed to go. The wedding day arrived with all the grandeur her family had demanded. White roses lined the aisle, a string quartet played softly in the background, and guests sipped champagne in crystal flutes, as though they were attending a royal affair. I moved through it all like a shadow, silent and steady, my expression unreadable. Claire was radiant, yes, but behind her smile, I saw the tension. Her family, on the other hand, was brimming with smug satisfaction. They believed they had caged me neatly with their prenup, that their legacy remained untainted. What they didn't realize was that they were celebrating their own downfall in real time. I had signed the prenup. Yes, I put ink to paper, calmly, without hesitation, because I knew something they didn't. It had no power over me. My lawyer had already dissected it, filing countersigned documents that made their version nothing more than a symbolic gesture. Their arrogance had blinded them to details, and I had exploited that blindness with surgical precision. They thought I had surrendered. In reality, I had reinforced my position so tightly that their claws could never reach me. It was the quietest form of victory, giving them exactly what they wanted, while ensuring it gave them nothing at all. During the reception, I watched the way her father strutted among his peers, shaking hands and dropping hints about responsible measures taken to protect the family. He had no idea that while he was boasting about an illusion. Wealthy men like him rarely understood the power of silence, the strength in keeping one's cards hidden. They dealt in appearances, in perception, in outward shows of control. My control, however, lived beneath the surface, invisible and untouchable. That was the difference between us. Claire's mother tried to corner me at one point, her tone dripping with condescension as she said, "It must feel good, Daniel, to know you're truly secure now." I looked at her, expression calm, voice steady, and replied, "Security isn't something that can be handed to you, it's something you build for yourself." She smiled thinly, not fully grasping the weight of what I had just said. And in that moment, I felt an almost serene detachment. They still thought I was playing their game, but I was already on an entirely different board. What they didn't know was that a quiet ripple had already begun moving beneath the surface of their empire. The prenup was only part of it. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I had unearthed whispers of their financial overextension, small cracks in their investments that they assumed no one outside their circle would notice. With a few calculated steps, perfectly legal, perfectly discreet, I positioned myself where those cracks would widen, not through sabotage, but through observation and timing. They believed they were protecting themselves from me. What they didn't see was that their downfall had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with their own arrogance. By the end of the night, as Claire and I danced under the artificial glow of chandeliers, I felt strangely calm. I wasn't celebrating, not in the way they thought. My victory wasn't about champagne toasts or whispered congratulations. It was about patience, about knowing that the seeds had already been planted and that soon, very soon, her family's illusion of control would begin to unravel. They thought they had won. They thought they had bent me. But control built on arrogance is fragile, and I had learned to wait for fragile things to break. The cracks in their foundation appeared sooner than even I had expected. Barely a month after the wedding, whispers began circulating in the financial press. A failed land development project, a miscalculated foreign investment, a lawsuit that had been brushed under the rug, suddenly clawing its way back to the surface. To the world, it looked like a string of bad luck. To me, it was the inevitable result of arrogance. I hadn't touched a thing. I didn't need to. I had simply paid attention, prepared myself, and positioned my resources so that when the storm hit, I would be untouchable. They had treated me as if I were desperate for their fortune, but now their fortune was bleeding, and I was standing in the calm, unshaken. Claire's father grew restless. The man who once moved through rooms with unshakable confidence now snapped at waiters, barked at his employees, and drank too much at dinner parties. His empire was shrinking, and the humiliation was visible in the lines of his face. He had spent decades crafting an image of invincibility, and now the mask was slipping. I watched silently, never offering a word of consolation, never gloating. I simply observed as the same man who once smirked at me across a marble counter now struggled to keep his world from collapsing. Silence had become my sharpest blade. Claire noticed the shift, too. The woman who once teased me about my frugal habits now asked if we could start living more modestly, as if the suggestion were her idea. I nodded, calm as ever, never pointing out the irony. She didn't know the truth, that while her family scrambled, my own wealth remained secure, even growing. My investments were thriving, my company expanding, my legal protections airtight. I had never needed their approval or their inheritance. And now, as her parents quietly drowned in their own mistakes, she began to realize that her safety, her comfort, her stability, none of it came from them anymore. It came from me, the man they had tried to strip of dignity. I didn't rub it in. That would have been easy, even satisfying in a shallow way. But true justice doesn't need an audience. Nor does it need applause. True justice happens when arrogance collides with reality, when those who underestimated you are forced to face the quiet weight of their own miscalculations. I never raised my voice, never uttered the words "I told you so." My silence once again was louder than any speech could have been. They had dismissed me as small, and yet now I was the only one standing tall. Weeks turned into months, and the decline accelerated. Properties were sold quietly. Family friends stopped visiting. Invitations dried up. The smug grins that had once welcomed me into their kitchen were replaced with forced smiles and eyes that couldn't quite meet mine. They had wanted a son-in-law they could control, a man they could mold to fit their hierarchy. Instead, they had bound themselves to a man who owed them nothing, who had never needed them, and who would watch them unravel without lifting a finger. And through it all, I remained steady. I went to work. I built my projects. I tended to my own life. I did not seek their approval, nor did I seek their downfall. Both came naturally, one by being unnecessary, the other by being inevitable. My revenge was not loud. It was not cruel. It was simply the quiet satisfaction of standing tall, while those who once looked down on me discovered that their throne was nothing more than a chair built on sand. The silence in their mansion was different now. It wasn't the dignified quiet of wealth, but the suffocating hush of decline. The once bustling halls of staff and catered dinners had grown thinner, quieter, stripped of excess. I visited less often, and when I did, I carried no resentment, no visible triumph. To them, my calm presence was unsettling. They couldn't place me anymore. Was I ally, enemy, or simply indifferent? The truth was, I had moved beyond them entirely. My world no longer revolved around their judgments. In private, I found myself thinking less about their downfall and more about my own resilience. I had walked into their trap without fear and walked out untouched. That was the lesson. Power isn't about fighting every battle. It's about knowing which ones to let collapse under their own weight. They had armed themselves with arrogance, and arrogance had devoured them from within. I didn't need to raise a hand. I didn't even need to raise my voice. Claire tried to pretend everything was normal, but she was caught between two worlds. On one side was the family she had been born into, proud and trembling on the edge of ruin. On the other was the man she married, steady, unbothered, moving forward no matter the chaos. I didn't demand she choose, but silently, I watched her drift toward me. Not out of love, but out of necessity. That distinction mattered. She wasn't choosing me, she was fleeing them. And in that realization, I understood something deeper. Loyalty cannot be borrowed, only earned. The greatest revenge, I realized, wasn't their ruin. It was my freedom. Freedom from the illusion that I ever needed their approval. Freedom from the idea that their wealth or status defined me. I had been wealthy long before they noticed me. I had been secure long before they questioned me. And now, as they faded, I stood taller not because they fell, but because I finally stopped caring about their gaze. I thought often about silence, the weapon that had carried me through it all. Silence when they mocked me. Silence when they underestimated me. Silence when they celebrated their false victory. That same silence now became my peace. I didn't have to tell the world my story. I didn't have to prove a thing. The truth lived quietly in my every decision, my every breath. In the end, redemption wasn't about crushing them. It was about reclaiming myself. Their downfall was theirs alone. My rise, mine alone. And for the first time in a long time, I could breathe without the weight of their shadows pressing on me. I had not shouted. I had not raged. I had simply lived quietly, intelligently, and free. In the months that followed, it became clear that the wedding had not been the start of a partnership, but the beginning of a test. Claire had grown restless. She no longer spoke of dreams we once shared, of traveling together, of building a future that felt like ours. Instead, her words revolved around her family's struggles, The shrinking fortune, the endless boardroom arguments, the whispered disgrace among their circle of friends. I listened, silently, my face calm, but inside I noted the shift. She wasn't leaning on me out of love. She was leaning because she had no other pillar left standing. At first, I tried to understand her unease. After all, it is difficult to watch the ground beneath you crumble, but soon I realized something sharper. She didn't just want comfort, she wanted rescue. Not rescue from her parents' arrogance, but rescue from its consequences. In her eyes, I wasn't a partner, I was a lifeboat. That realization carried a sting sharper than the prenup ever had. Love, I knew, is not meant to be transactional, and yet with her it had become exactly that. I never confronted her directly. That was not my way. Instead, I watched. I watched how she flinched whenever I mentioned independence, how she dismissed my quiet habits as if they lacked ambition. She did not see that my habits were discipline, the same discipline that had built everything I owned. She couldn't understand, because she had never built anything from nothing. To her, wealth had always been a given, until it wasn't. That gap between us widened with every passing day. Her parents, once so proud and commanding, were now shadows of themselves. Her father's phone calls grew shorter, clipped, desperate. Her mother's smiles became brittle masks, cracking at the edges. Yet even in their weakness, they clung to arrogance. They still believed they could recover, that reputation could be salvaged with enough performance. Claire carried that same blindness, that same refusal to see reality, and in her refusal she drifted further from me. I found myself retreating into silence once more, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of strategy or patience. It was the silence of detachment. I no longer felt the urge to defend myself, or to prove my worth, or to correct her assumptions. She could think what she wanted, believe what she needed. I had already learned that people who dismiss your value will never see it clearly until it is too late. I had nothing left to prove to her or her family. One evening, as she lamented yet another financial blow to her parents' empire, I looked at her and saw the truth. She was not my partner. She was still their daughter, bound by their illusions, shaped by their fears. And in that moment I felt no anger, no grief, only clarity. The woman I had thought I loved was still standing in the shadow of her parents, and I had no intention of standing there with her any longer. While their world shrank, mine expanded. Quietly, without announcement, I began doubling down on the ventures that had carried me this far. Real estate projects matured, new technology investments bore fruit, and my holdings, spread wide and deliberately, grew stronger with each passing quarter. I didn't flaunt it. I didn't change my habits or my lifestyle. I simply worked, observed, and allowed time to reward the discipline they once mocked. It was not just wealth I was building. It was independence, layer upon layer, until there was nothing in my life that could be touched by their decline. I noticed the shift in how people approached me. Men who once only shook my hand out of politeness now sought my counsel. Partners who had once been skeptical of my quiet style now admired it openly, even envied it in boardrooms and private dinners. My reputation had begun to harden into something solid, a man who never boasted, never panicked, never revealed too much, but always delivered. Meanwhile, Claire's family, desperate for attention, leaned harder into their fading image, clinging to appearances as though appearances could pay their debts. I could see the contrast beginning to weigh on Claire. At social events, the once proud introductions had shifted in tone. It was no longer Daniel married into the Whitmore family. Instead, whispers carried Claire married Daniel. Subtle, but undeniable. The power dynamic had inverted, and she felt it. Her gaze lingered on me differently now. not with admiration but with confusion. She didn't understand how the man they had dismissed as unworthy now stood taller than all of them combined. And yet I never gloated. I never corrected her. I let her sit with the discomfort, because discomfort is its own teacher. I had no interest in rubbing salt into wounds. I was too focused on creation, on growth, on ensuring that my empire would endure not just a decade, but generations. If there was revenge in my success, it was not the loud kind. It was the kind that comes from living so well, so completely, that the weight of their scorn turned into dust beneath my feet. Claire tried in her own way to bridge the gap. She suggested that perhaps I could help her family, an offer disguised as casual conversation, but heavy with expectation. I listened, nodded politely, and changed the subject. She didn't press me, but I could feel the tension simmering between us. She knew I could save them. She also knew I would not. Some battles are meant to be fought, others are meant to be lost, because only in losing do people learn the cost of arrogance. At night, I often thought of the man I was before all of this. The man who once sought approval, who once worried about being underestimated. That man was gone. What remained was someone forged in silence, sharpened by betrayal, and steadied by patience. My empire was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. And in that pursuit I had discovered the sweetest form of freedom, the freedom of not needing them at all. It happened slowly at first, like shadows stretching across the floor as the sun sinks. Claire began to look at me differently. Her questions carried a sharper edge, not out of curiosity but out of frustration. "How did you know this investment would work?" she asked one evening, staring at the reports on my desk. I answered simply, without flourish. "I paid attention." She frowned as though the answer was incomplete. But I had no desire to explain further. I owed her no roadmap, no manual for what discipline and foresight had given me. At dinners, I noticed how restless she became. She would watch me engage with others, business partners, old friends, acquaintances, and she saw the quiet respect they carried for me. It unsettled her, because for years she believed her family was the source of status, of value. Now she saw something else entirely, that I had built my own orbit, one she had neither created nor contributed to. She began to realize that she had married a man she had never truly known, and perhaps never truly understood. Her confusion turned into small cracks of resentment. I could feel it in the way she dismissed my habits, calling them boring or predictable. She had once found comfort in my steadiness. Now it felt like a mirror she couldn't face. My silence, which had once been mysterious to her, now became unbearable. She wanted explanations, justifications, grand speeches of triumph, but I had none to give. My silence was not withholding, it was simply who I was, and she could not live in it. One night, after a particularly strained dinner with her parents, she turned to me and asked, "Why won't you help them?" Her eyes burned with desperation, almost anger. I looked at her, calm and steady, and replied softly, "Because they never wanted my help. They only wanted my obedience." She stared at me for a long time, and I could see the truth in her eyes. She knew I was right, but truth is a bitter drink, and she turned away without another word. The distance between us widened with every unspoken moment. She drifted toward the remnants of her family, clinging to their fading name, while I drifted toward creation, growth, and peace. We still shared a house, still shared a life on paper, but in spirit we were already living on separate shores. I no longer reached for her hand, and she no longer reached for mine. We had become two actors playing roles in a marriage that had already unraveled. And yet, I felt no rage, no heartbreak, only clarity. The woman I once thought would stand beside me through anything had chosen her inheritance over love, illusion over truth. And I had chosen silence, freedom, and the steady march forward. She was finally beginning to understand the cost of underestimating me. But understanding as she was learning does not undo the choices already made. With Claire and her family consumed by their own unraveling, I turned my attention outward. I began investing not for show or status, but for purpose. I funded small businesses overlooked by the traditional banking system, helped entrepreneurs who lacked connections but had vision, and supported causes that mattered to communities rather than committees. Every decision was deliberate, calculated, yet driven by a sense of responsibility. It wasn't about making headlines, it was about making impact, quietly, without needing acknowledgement. I noticed the difference between my approach and the way her family once operated. They had built walls around themselves, defending wealth rather than creating opportunity. Their influence had always been performative, a display, a social game. My investments, in contrast, were alive, growing with the people they touched. I reveled in the satisfaction of seeing real results. Businesses that survived, individuals who thrived, communities that were strengthened. My fortune, once a private shield, had become a tool for positive change. Claire began to notice too. She would accompany me occasionally to a local startup or community meeting, and she couldn't hide the mixture of awe and guilt in her eyes. I never explained why I did what I did. I simply led by example, quietly demonstrating that true power is not about control, but about contribution. The contrast was undeniable, my calm, purposeful life versus the chaotic remnants of her parents' fading empire. I did not gloat, I did not taunt. I simply lived in the quiet dignity of results. The more I gave, the more the ripple of impact expanded. Entrepreneurs who had once struggled now flourished. Small businesses became sustainable, communities more resilient, and I realized that the revenge I had executed months before, subtle, precise, and silent, was a prologue to a larger purpose. Whereas her family's arrogance had consumed them, my patience and wisdom created enduring value. I had built an empire that would outlast grudges, mistakes, and illusions. In private moments, I reflected on how differently I had been shaped by betrayal. The lessons of silence, observation, and strategic restraint applied not only to vengeance, but to creation. The discipline that allowed me to watch Claire's family crumble without interference now fueled this legacy. I had transformed what began as a personal conflict into a demonstration of what measured strength can accomplish when directed toward growth, rather than destruction. And so, life moved forward in quiet triumph. I had not only survived betrayal, I had transcended it. While Claire and her family wrestled with the consequences of their choices, I was building something permanent, something meaningful. My peace was no longer contingent on their downfall. It was reinforced by the positive world I had quietly shaped, a world that required neither approval nor recognition to exist. It was subtle at first, missed payments, delayed projects, quiet whispers among their peers, but soon the decline became undeniable. Their empire, once glittering with influence and wealth, began to crumble under the weight of mismanagement and hubris. Boards that had once bowed to the family's name now questioned every move. Contracts fell through. Investments that were assumed to be untouchable evaporated almost overnight. And through it all I watched silently, unshaken, untouched. Their downfall had nothing to do with me anymore. It was entirely self-inflicted. Claire, once proud and certain, now carried the stress of their failures, like a shadow she could not escape. She looked to me often, seeking guidance or reassurance, but I had withdrawn into measured detachment. My empire was insulated, my wealth unthreatened, my decisions deliberate. She began to realize that she had placed herself in the middle of a storm she could neither control nor navigate. The contrast between her insecurity and my stability became painfully obvious. Her father's arrogance began to falter visibly. Public appearances grew tense. His carefully curated smile became brittle. He had spent decades wielding power, believing control was absolute, and now he discovered that the universe had little patience for inflated egos. His frustration was palpable, yet he had no outlet. Every attempt to recover was met with resistance or failure, and he could see it. I, on the other hand, moved with calm certainty, untouched by the chaos around me, a quiet reminder of what discipline and patience yield. Her mother, too, struggled to maintain appearances. Invitations were ignored. Friends who had once lined the corridors of their lavish parties began to distance themselves. Reputation, once their currency, had evaporated faster than anyone could have predicted. Claire watched her parents fall, silently recognizing that their arrogance had blinded them to reality. And for the first time she also saw that I had never been reliant on their approval or fortune. My world had always been self-sufficient, and that independence was now undeniable. I continued to expand quietly, building influence and creating opportunities for those who deserved them. Each success reminded me of how far I had come, not just financially, but emotionally. The collapse around me was not a victory to gloat over. It was a confirmation of a principle I had learned long ago. Power built on fear and arrogance is fragile, while power rooted in patience, wisdom, and self-respect endures. Claire's family, once untouchable in their confidence, was now a cautionary tale, and I remained the observer, steady and unshaken. By the end of the year, the contrast was complete. Her family's name, once synonymous with wealth and influence, was quietly tarnished. Invitations and connections vanished. Their world, meticulously curated for appearances, had no real foundation. Meanwhile, I continued forward, untethered, unbent, and entirely free. The silence that had once been my strategy for revenge had become my shield for life, and through it I discovered the ultimate form of control, to be untouched by chaos while it destroys others. The decision to distance myself from Claire was not sudden, nor was it dramatic. It was a natural conclusion to months of observation, reflection, and understanding. She had remained tethered to the remnants of her family's fading influence, unable or unwilling to see the life I had quietly built beside her. I realized that remaining close would not benefit either of us. Love, I had learned, cannot thrive in the shadow of dependency and unresolved illusions, and so I chose detachment, deliberate and calm, rather than confrontation or accusation. I began to shift routines subtly, creating spaces for myself that were independent of her. I spent more time in my offices, more time in the communities I had supported, more time alone with thoughts I had long postponed. I didn't announce this to her or to anyone else. The change was a quiet ripple, noticeable only in its absence. She noticed it, of course, though she could not articulate what it meant. I didn't need her to. My independence was a reality she could feel, not a lesson I needed to lecture on. Claire tried to reach me at first, seeking engagement, explanations, or even reassurance. I listened with calm neutrality, never defending my choices, never pleading. The emotional weight she sought to place on me no longer landed. Her frustration was palpable, and I felt none of the irritation I might have felt in the past. My detachment was not cruelty. It was the recognition that some connections are no longer reciprocal, and the best action is to allow life to unfold as it will. Even in our shared home, boundaries became natural and unforced. She moved through her day absorbed in the fallout of her family's ruin, and I moved through mine engaged in creation and growth. Our paths, once intertwined, now ran parallel. She was learning, slowly, that I was not her safety net, nor her solution, nor her lifeline, and I was learning, fully, that freedom often requires the courage to step quietly away from what no longer serves your growth. Financially, legally, and emotionally, I ensured that nothing about this separation would leave me vulnerable. My wealth had always been structured with foresight, my assets protected, my influence cultivated. Even in detachment, I was untouchable. The prenup, the family's arrogance, the illusions of control, they were all behind me now. What remained was clarity, order, and a life guided solely by my own choices. In the silence of this separation, I discovered an unexpected serenity. There was no rage, no vindictive satisfaction, no dramatic declaration. Instead, there was a sense of closure, of boundaries respectfully asserted, of life reclaimed. I was free, not from love, not from connection, but from entanglements that could not respect the strength, patience, and wisdom I had cultivated. And in that freedom, I felt a power far greater than any revenge could have offered, control over myself and my destiny. Time became a companion rather than a measure of pressure. Days passed without the tension that once hovered around every interaction with Claire or her family. I moved through life with the quiet confidence of someone who had endured betrayal, executed patience, and emerged not just intact, but stronger. My empire, my community impact, and my personal life all thrived in ways I had never imagined when I first faced their arrogance. Peace, I realized, was not granted, it was earned through deliberate choices and disciplined detachment. I spent mornings walking through the projects I had supported, observing the businesses that had once struggled, now thriving under their own momentum. Entrepreneurs greeted me not with fear or expectation, but with gratitude and trust. I found a satisfaction in their growth that no confrontation, no revenge, and no display of power could ever have provided. This was the reward of strategic patience, the quiet knowledge that true influence is built, nurtured, and allowed to flourish without coercion. Claire faded from my life with no drama, no confrontation, only absence. She remained tied to her family's illusions, and I remained tied to my reality. There were no bitter words, no recriminations, no lingering resentment. In fact, I barely thought of her anymore except in reflection, understanding that she had played her part in the story and that her role had ended. The life I had fought for, defended with patience and intelligence, was mine entirely, and that realization carried a calm, unshakable power. I took time to invest in myself as well, reading, traveling, and exploring possibilities that had been impossible when I was distracted by betrayal and manipulation. I surrounded myself with individuals who valued integrity, insight, and quiet strength, rather than status or inherited wealth. Each new experience, each conversation, each decision reinforced the lesson I had learned. The most profound victories are internal, unannounced, and deeply personal. There were nights when I reflected on the journey, the betrayal, the patience, the silent victories. I understood finally that revenge had not been the ultimate goal. The goal had been clarity, dignity, and self-respect. In the absence of conflict, I had built resilience. In the absence of recognition, I had built freedom. In the absence of their approval, I had discovered the strength to shape my own destiny without compromise. And so I stand now at the peak of quiet triumph, unbent, unshaken, and entirely at peace. The chaos of her family's decline is a distant echo, irrelevant to the life I have constructed. My legacy, my freedom, and my sense of self are intact and untouchable. I no longer need to prove anything. The betrayal that once threatened me now exists only as a memory, a teacher, and a reminder that silence, patience, and intelligence can achieve a victory far deeper than any spectacle of vengeance.